Welcome everyone to the Hoover Institution Workshop on using text as data in policy analysis. My name is Stephen Davis, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and one of the organizers of this workshop. Today's workshop features a paper on the diffusion of new technologies by 6 authors. They are Akash Kalyani from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, Nick Bloom here at Stanford, and my partner in research on policy uncertainty, remote work, and other topics, Marcel at Harvard, Tarek Hassan, Boston University, and my former colleague for many years at Chicago Booth, Josh Lerner, Harvard, and my collaborator in research on private equity buyouts, and Ahmed Tahoun at the London Business School. Also here today is Justin Grimmer, who has been organizing this workshop since its inception with me. So here's our format. The authors will take about 30 minutes to present their work, a Q&A and a discussion. If you've got a question or comment, put it into the Q&A box. We will run for about 60 minutes. After that, we'll turn off the recording and continue with a more informal conversation for anyone who wants to stick around. All right, gentlemen, and I don't think Marcel is here, so this show is yours.
Okay. Thank you for having us here to present this paper. And so this is, as I said, like Nick, Tarek, and Josh are here, so they'll probably be answering your chat questions. And I'm from the St. Louis Fed, so the general Fed disclaimer applies. The views expressed in this paper are those of the authors and not necessarily of the Fed or the Fed system. So we all know that new technologies are key to economic growth. However, there are rising concerns over new technologies, especially over income inequality and regional inequality. So for example, do technology jobs spread beyond college graduates? Do they spread beyond Silicon Valley? And these questions have been hard to answer because it's been hard to measure the development of multiple technologies in a single framework and then identify those that most affect businesses and jobs. So in this paper, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to use the full text of patents, Wikipedia, and job postings to identify influential technological technologies. We will trace them to locations and firms where they were developed in the first place, and then we'll measure the diffusion through job postings, regions, and skill levels. So we'll have technologies, we'll trace them to where they were first developed, and then we'll measure their diffusion. And now, having collected this data, and done this measurement exercise, we document 4 main findings. The first is that the development of economically most impactful technologies is geographically extremely concentrated. The second is that the new technology job postings, they spread slowly over locations, and we call this region broadening. Now, as they slowly spread over locations, they also spread down the skill ladder. So initially, these technology job postings have a very high skill requirement, but this skill requirement declines slowly over time. We call this skill broadening. Now, region and skill broadening are kind of related to each other, and which is that low skill job postings, so job postings which use these new technologies, they tend to spread faster across space. So essentially, the use of these job postings in low skill occupations is the one which drives region broadening. We also find that the advantage of pioneer locations, so locations which pioneered the initial development of these technologies, those locations maintain their advantage in high skill postings for over 40 years. So as low skill job postings spread through use, the pioneering locations, they retain the advantage in high skill job postings for over 40 years. Now, because of the shorter format of this presentation, I'm not going to go in detail through the literature, but I'm just going to highlight that in this paper, we identify a panel of new technologies. We track their spread using text to data, and then we provide evidence on region and skill broadening. So that's kind of the overall big picture of this paper. So over the rest of the talk, we're going to take you through this in 5 steps. In the first 2, we're going to tell you how we identify these technologies and how we trace them in job postings. And the last 3 facts will be about the diffusion. Okay, So to do this, we use 4 key text-to-data sources. The first one is patents, relatively very well known. The second one is Wikipedia pages, which are less used in economics. And the third one is transcripts of earnings conference calls. And finally, we use the full text of online job postings, which is also, the job postings have been fairly widely used in economics, but the text of these job postings is still used in less studies. So to identify these technologies, we're going to first start with identifying phrases associated with influential innovations. And we're going to do this in 2 steps. In the first one, we're going to extract all bigrams from influential US patents with at least 1,000 citations. So to look for influential phrases, we're going to go to influential US patents. So if I was to decompose the line here into bigrams, it would be extract all bigrams from, and so on. So we'll decompose the full text of these patents into these 2-word combinations or bigrams. Then to focus on new influential phrases, which identify influential innovations, we're going to only keep those which are not in common use prior to 1970. And to do that, we'll use Corpus of Historical American English. It's a collection of representative text from magazines, articles, and it's decade by decade. So we'll kick out all these bigrams which are used in the Corpus of Historical American English prior to 1970. Now, these 2 steps give us a list of 35,000 novel bigrams associated with influential innovations. And they can be largely categorized into 3 categories. The first one is technological innovations, the ones we want. So fingerprint sensor, monoclonal antibody, OLED display, these we call technological innovations. We also have new problems. For example, greenhouse gases, Parkinson's disease, carbon footprint, and then some managerial innovations, agile project, performance metrics, and business model. So to do this classification between these 3 categories of these 35,000 phrases, what we use is Wikipedia. And in particular, we'll exploit the standardized nature of Wikipedia phrases describing these technological innovations. So you see here the page for mobile device. Now this page has a section on characteristics, a section on types, a section on uses of mobile device. And we'll use precisely this structure of technology pages to classify our phrases into technological innovations and others. So here we're highlighting so similar structure is also for here machine learning. It has applications, limitations. So this page describes the applications and limitations of machine learning. So on the next slide, I'll take you through exactly what we do. So we match each of the 35,000 phrases to a Wikipedia page. So we do that by just counting it in the title, summary, or if it appears 10 times on the page, then we'll say that the phrase is corresponding to the Wikipedia page. In step 2, we'll classify the Wikipedia page into a technological innovation, a new problem, or a managerial innovation. And so we look for sections on applications, uses, types, operations, characteristics, features, development, and technical and commercial. So if any section, any of these sections corresponds to the Wikipedia page, and it does not contain a section on responses, mitigation, problems, causes, signs, symptoms, and also not on management, manager, risk assessment, business model, and so on, then we'll call this a technology Wikipedia page or a technological innovation Wikipedia page. Through this process, we can classify out of the 35,000, about 4,000 bigrams into what we call a technological innovation. And then we'll conveniently group these bigrams by circling them using the Wikipedia page into 2,600 technologies. So we started with 35,000 phrases. We went to 4,000 bigrams, which correspond to technological innovations. And now we have a set of 2,600 technologies, which are conveniently grouping these influential innovation bigrams into technologies. So before we document the diffusion patterns and the development patterns, we will collect 2 characteristics of these technologies, again, using the structure of a data set. So so the first characteristic is the emergence year. So to calculate the emergence year, we will cross-reference cross-reference these phrases to the full text or patents, and we look for early accelerated development of these phrases. In particular, we define a year of emergence as a year in patents when the side-weighted number of mentions grows by at least 10% for 5 consecutive years. So when this accelerated development takes place, then we call that year to be the emergence year of that technology. So for smartphone, it's the mid 1990s. For digital video, it's the late 1980s, and so on. The second is we will collect the pioneering location for these technologies, and we'll again use this accelerated development. But now we will look for the locations where this accelerated development initially took place. So we'll define a pioneering location as a top CBSA, core-based statistical area or urban areas, which account for 50% of a technology's patents 10 years after the year of emergence. So when the innovation related to this technology is really picking up, where is it really picking up? And so here you see examples. So for self-driving car, it's Silicon Valley and Detroit. For digital imaging, it's Rochester, which is the headquarters of Kodak. Fort Collins, which is another office of Kodak. Silicon Valley and LA. For smartphones, it's Silicon Valley, Seattle, LA. For lane departure warning, it's Grand Rapids, Michigan. And these are the places where the initial accelerated development of these technologies took place. So far, essentially, we have a list of technologies, of diagrams corresponding to those technologies, and for each of these technologies, we have an emergence year, and we have the location where the initial development of these technologies took place. So we can go ahead and we can look for these technologies in job postings. So here you see an example of how we spot these technologies into job postings. So this is an example job posting by Facebook. It's posted in New York. It's for an applied research scientist, and it scrapes from Glassdoor. And it says, it essentially mentions a lot of our biograms. So for example, we have speech recognition, machine learning, artificial intelligence, deep learning, and so on. And so if a job posting mentions any of these biograms, then it's labeled as a technology job posting corresponding to that technology. So we go through these, we sample about 1,000 of these job postings to understand what context do they really mention these technologies in. And we find that about 2/3 of these job postings are about the use of the technology, and 1/3 of them are about development or production. So on the left-hand side here, you see a job posting for a sales representative, and it says use third channel technology on a smart device to collect crucial data, engage with consumers. So it's essentially saying that the requirement is to use a smart device for the job. On the right-hand side, you see a systems engineer, which is producing with the job, essentially saying that the person will be responsible for development, testing, and validation of new chips in the growing smart TV market. Now, we also go through a similar process, and we look for these technologies in earnings calls, and we find that technologies that preoccupy earnings calls also are key for jobs. And in general, as technologies have more and more appearance in earnings calls, they appear more and more in job postings. And in fact, technologies which appear in more than 100 earnings calls account for about 77% of overall technology job postings, which we find. And so that's sort of like the large chunk of the variation in the data. So to take you through rest of the results using this measurement, I'll hand it over to Josh.
Thank you very much, Akash. So we're now going to talk really about 3 sets of results that we came up with in the analyses, and the first of these relates to geography. First of all, you see a lot of geographic concentration, and in particular, when you look at the right-hand side, those in the previous graph, the technologies that have more earnings call mentions and are more likely to be in job announcements, one sees those are particularly concentrated. So here what we do is we line up the earnings, we line up the technologies by how many earnings call mentions they have, with as few as 2 or less to all the way to 500 or more, and look at how concentrated the patenting in the earlier years is. And what one sees is that for the really high impact technologies, the ones that end up chewing up a lot of real estate in earnings calls, which are obviously time sensitive, relatively limited kind of events, and the ones which are mentioned in a lot of job announcements, they're extremely concentrated, with almost one half of the patents in the early years being in essentially 5 of these CBSAs, the 2 associated with Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, and Seattle. As one moves down the pecking order in terms of earnings calls and the like, they become considerably less concentrated, with the sort of smallest group being only half as concentrated as the ones which are mentioned in the most earnings calls. As we mentioned, the places where they're concentrated, and again, here this uses this notion of pioneering location of where the patents take place, are certainly not spread evenly around the country. And in fact, one can see that Silicon Valley alone, which is the San Jose and San Francisco CBSAs, essentially represents a huge chunk of the activity, as does the northeastern United States. And that between the 2 of them, one's talking about somewhere on the order of 55% of the pioneering locations of development of this. And again, many of the other places which are featured, whether LA, Seattle, Chicago, and the like, it's certainly not a random assortment of places. We now turn to the patterns that we see over time. And perhaps the way to do this is to best just present it graphically. So here we look at jobs which are associated with these technologies in the first 5 years after that emergence, which you recall from Akash's picture was where you essentially have the beginning of a rapid growth. And what one sees is that those pioneering locations, the ones which had a lot of the early patenting, are also the places that have much of the initial jobs being created, that they're really those round circles are exactly the same places where the colored circle, the blue empty circles, are exactly the places where the colored circles representing jobs are taking place. But as you go forward in time, and here we go from 6 to 10, and then we can subsequently go from look at 11 onwards, we see that the jobs spread out. There's still a bunch of jobs in the pioneering locations, but almost like a pat of butter on a griddle, the jobs seem to be much more spreading out across urban areas across the country. We, of course, can look at this not just simply qualitatively as those pictures, but actually formally test some of this. And to do that, we essentially create a normalized share for each technology year region, which is essentially how much of the jobs in a given technology, in a given year, in a given region are as concentrated or more or less concentrated than jobs as a whole. Essentially, we want to make sure that we're not making it seem like essentially LA and New York have, a disproportionate share just because they're big. We'd almost, we'd expect them to have, more jobs in any given novel technology just because there's so many jobs there compared to Omaha or Topeka. So we essentially do this normalization and then essentially try to compute, essentially this coefficient of variation, which you can understand as the sort of ratio of the standard deviation of these normalized shares to the average of the shares. When you look at this coefficient of variation, what one sees is that in the years after a technology emerges, just as that picture suggested, the jobs tend to spread out, that the coefficient of variation goes from about 5.5 in the earliest years to closer to 3.5 in the later period. Now, I guess you can say, is 3.5 or 5.5 a big number or not? Well, I guess one way to sort of think about that is to sort of look at something like college graduates. There, the coefficient is 3. So essentially what this is saying is that even 30 years after the technology emerges, the jobs, well, certainly not as concentrated as in the earliest days, are still more concentrated than, for instance, college jobs in general. You can also look at this in regression format, and whether you look at just the most influential technologies or technologies as a whole, one sees this sort of very clear negative trend, which reflects the gradual diffusion of jobs across the country over time. But there's a catch, and this sort of hints at some of the issue, and we'll develop this notion a little bit later on, that when you split up the jobs between those which are high skilled and low skilled, and here we're essentially looking at whether the given job title is typically associated with a college degree or not, though we do it in a variety of other ways as well. What one sees is that the good jobs, the high skilled and typically high paying jobs, diffuse slowly, while the lower skilled and typically lower paying jobs diffuse much more rapidly. So in a way, what we see is that even from here is that essentially technology related jobs are indeed, even though they're very lumpy in terms of where they start out and really benefit the coast. The good news is that these things are going to spread out, but in many cases, they're not spreading out evenly, and many of the best jobs are staying concentrated in the coastal places where they originate. We can also look at this by doing, as Akash suggested earlier, splitting up jobs between the ones that just simply use the technologies as opposed to the ones that are doing R&D or product development around these jobs. And not surprisingly, the jobs associated with R&D and production and so forth are much more likely to have college-educated people associated with them. And when we do the same split, but now not high and low skilled, but between using the technology, so for instance, using the iPad to enter orders at a concession stand versus essentially doing the research, development, and production of iPads, we see again that the diffusion is much more rapid of the use jobs rather than the R&D intensive positions. What we also see is that there's a lot of stickiness, that by and large, even when you control for the spreading out, one sees this persistent benefit of the pioneer locations that hold on to a disproportionate number of jobs in these cases. And again, this is true for the most elite technologies, the ones with lots of earnings calls and jobs, as well as the more general set of jobs as well. Moreover, this lasts for a long time. As we see across in general, if you try to calculate how long is it until the dispersion of these jobs, is essentially even, or essentially looks like it would, looks like it would in terms of jobs in general. What one sees, it's about 34 years, and that particularly when it comes to the high skilled and RDP, the research, development, production jobs, we're talking about in the 40s of years. So in case of RDP, almost half a century later, there's still essentially unfair advantage of those initial locations in terms of having more of the job activity. Finally, we try to look at skill broadening, or essentially this notion of saying, how are jobs changing associated with these technologies? What we see is that initially, very early on, we have a very high share of jobs associated with new technologies right after their emergence, being college educated. As we see here in the earlier years, it's about 56, 57% of those jobs are associated with a college degree, which we can compare with the 27% of US jobs more generally. And then what we see is that over time, it diffuses outwards, but as one sees, even after 3 decades, it's still well above the norm for jobs in general in the US. We can, of course, look at this in regression form as well, and we see very consistent kind of patterns. Now, we try to look a little bit more depth in understanding why it might be that you do see this pattern of skill broadening. One idea which has been developed in the literature, perhaps most closely associated with Daron Acemoglu, is that essentially there's an initial wave in terms of research in new technologies. Over time, they become largely standardized, so the need for skills is lower. The other notion may be one that training becomes more systematized and people are in a better position, even without, extensive college education and to be able to use technologies on the basis of vocational training and the like. So again, what we try to do is look at the job announcements and either pull out references that refer directly to research in terms of technologies, as well as ones that talk about requiring earlier training about these positions. What we do find is sort of consistent with the hypothesis mentioned in Daron's papers, that we do see this sort of decline over time in terms of job postings involving R&D and so forth. One sees less convincing evidence around training. And similarly, when we do some regression analyses, we see that the diffusion pattern, the sort of tendency to sort of be less college educated, is in large part explained by the change in terms of R&D postings, that one has a rather significant drop of a coefficient, for instance, from column 1 to columns 2 or 3, but that there's, if we look at column 5, there's almost no impact in terms of training. Thus, what we see here is that we have developed this methodology to look at essentially new and impactful technologies, to look not just simply at a case study as one particular technology, but essentially to look with as much of the literature is done, whether it's looking at hybrid corn or robots or the like, but to look really across a very wide range of technologies and to try to understand the patterns more generally. We document the sort of extreme initial geographic concentration. We see that it spreads over time, not perhaps as fast as we might like, the jobs involving these technologies, but we do see a clear region broadening. We also see a skill broadening, that the jobs start off with very skill biased, very high-end kind of positions, and over time it spreads out. But perhaps feeding perhaps some of the skepticism about the distributional consequences of new technologies, we see that there's a much quicker spread of the low-skilled jobs using these technologies rather than the ones which are the higher skilled jobs involving the R&D and production of these things, which remain concentrated in the initial hubs, typically around the coasts. And that these are not just a pattern of a few years, but this is really of decades and beyond. So with that, I will thank people and stop sharing and look forward to any queries that there may be.
Thanks, Josh and Akash. That was a great presentation and super interesting work. I got two questions to start off. One's narrow and one's broader. The narrow one, unless I missed it, you never really gave us any information about the fraction of jobs that are impacted by what you define as new technologies. So I couldn't tell from your work whether it's 0.5% or 5%, say down the road, 20, 30 years after their introduction. So if you could speak to that, because much of the concern about new technologies is how they might displace existing work. And I realized that's not the focus of your study. But it would still help us understand whether these new technologies are ultimately showing up in 1, 5, or whatever % of job ads 10, 20 years down the road. The second question I'm going to ask, and you can ponder this one, it's a little bit asking you to extrapolate. There's intense concern over the potential for AI-based technologies to displace work. And the latest hype around generative AI technologies like ChatGPT. Are there any lessons you can draw from your work about how rapidly the diffusion of new AI-based technologies might take place in the labor market, and whether they will ultimately affect some large percentage of jobs? Beyond the scope of your paper, but you guys have been working in this vein, and people will be super interested in whatever informed conjectures that you have on that question. So I'll turn it over to you guys.
So I'm going to do the second one because so we have a number. I was looking it up on so for your very first question, what percentage of jobs mention a new technology? I think it's about 1/3, but I'm gonna look into paper and try and find the exact number. Akash, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we're talking about millions.
So that's big.
It's big.
You also have to consider so these technologies, we observed them starting in 1980, and so on. So of course, if you consider the average technology, and there's a lot of heterogeneity, then the average technology is about 1%. But there's a very fat tail to that average technology.
So
but the overall number of
on that. So if I take one of your most disruptive technologies, then what would be the average share of jobs that's affected by that, say 20 years down the road, after what you define as the emergence share?
Yeah, so we looked at this number going back. I think we don't have this in the draft, but when we looked at this 20 years down the road, the average technology is about 1%. But as you can imagine, there's a huge range, and this average is driven by the tail. Smartphones is probably the most common appearance technology in job postings, and that sort of drives the average up. Yeah.
Okay, so the most disruptive technologies within 20 years or so affect a large share of jobs. That's what I hear you saying. Okay.
So we have stared very carefully at the following question, which is somewhat close to what you're asking. So we have split our sample into technologies that are highly disruptive in the sense that they affect many jobs and are frequently mentioned in earnings calls, and those that are less so. And we've looked very carefully for differences in the speed of diffusion, both geographically and down the skill ladder between these two groups. And we found nothing that's statistically significant. So one thing that you might have thought is that the most impactful technology spread faster. It is possible that it's sort of buried in our sample at the very, very tail end, but we haven't really found evidence of that. So I wouldn't dare like extrapolate to AI from that, but at least historically, it doesn't seem like.
Well, okay, let me push a little bit then. What machine learning? When was the emergence year for machine learning, according to you guys? One of the technologies.
Steve, while they're looking it up on the AI question, our data right now is running up to 2019, but an immediate thing to do. I mean, this paper is, is like hopefully close to completion. But I think the next step to do is to push the data up to 2024, because all the hype over AI, is in the last couple of years. It's almost like pandemic. So I know the census put out something the other day showing only 3 or 4% of jobs report using AI, but it's that S-curve diffusion thing. So I see it as like we're well set up to look at it going forwards, but as of yet, probably levels are relatively low, but I suspect we're on that kind of slope. The other tricky thing is, in the stuff I saw from the census, it said the biggest users of AI currently are things like chatbots and like spam marketing. And if you lose your job because of you being replaced by a chatbot, you don't show up in our data set. So we'll pick up like the people who are using it and getting jobs. But if you are, an entry-level call center employee that got kicked out, you wouldn't show up. So we can kind of see we can see the new jobs. We cut other data sets. It's interesting. Other data sets are great at seeing the jobs that are lost. If you think of all the China trade stuff, they're fantastic at seeing all the jobs that are lost from trade, but terrible at seeing the new jobs. We're kind of the reverse. We're great at seeing the new jobs, but it's harder to pick up the lost ones.
And in machine learning?
1992.
Okay.
So we sort of pick up the first accelerated development, and turns out that the first accelerated development in machine learning was in 1992. But then more recently, there's another accelerated development. So if you could sort of take that and then observe the jobs going forward. It's just that our data is limited, as Nick pointed out.
Well, I would say two things are also buried in the data that we haven't had time to look at. One is these different technologies differ widely in the time pattern of their development. So as Akash mentioned, there are some that have multiple modes. So virtual reality is like the best example of that. Was like if you remember, it was like very exciting in the 90s, and then kind of didn't work out, and then it disappeared for a while, and now it's back. And others have a more linear, you saw it for the smartphone, it just went up like that and stayed up. So that's a time series of data that kind of is produced in our process here that we haven't looked at. The other kind of really interesting part of the data that you can look at is calculating penetration rates into different occupations. So these technologies differ widely in the number of occupations that they penetrate. So in a sense, you have a sort of like an empirical notion of what's a general purpose technology versus not, by saying a general purpose technology is one that penetrates many occupations. Presumably, going down that path would eventually lead you to say something about the downside, or maybe the amount of disruption that is happening within a given profession. We haven't really had the time to think about that carefully, but certainly with this sort of text-based methodology, you can get a handle on that as well.
Great. I'll let Justin, I've got other questions, but I'll let Justin jump in here.
Yeah, Steve anticipated one of my questions with the machine learning point, which it can also be difficult to distinguish emergence of new technology and the emergence of new branding. If we were to apply this exercise in the academy, we might be like, oh, there's a data science diffusion and revolution. And so maybe I missed this, but maybe you can articulate it. How do I think about the population of technologies that we're studying and diffusing here? Because surely there are a lot of technologies that start up, seem like a good idea, and then fail to diffuse, would be harder to detect. Or, something like machine learning or neural nets, which like kick around for a long time, and all of a sudden there's like a moment. So when we say something about like the speed of diffusion, how should I think about the population of technologies that I'm thinking about where I can characterize the speed?
Justin, I'll give you one quick answer. It's more of a learning for us. I'm not so much saying it's good or bad about the paper, but it's like a bit of a Goldilocks area. So if the technology just never goes anywhere, it doesn't show up in our data set. In some ways, that's fine, because we're only looking at in a sense, technologies that have some minimal impact. The weird thing is, if you go to the other extreme, like electricity, everyone uses electricity every day in their job, full stop. I can't imagine a single American that doesn't use it, but it doesn't show up in job postings. So we kind of have this just right period that early on, we're picking up a lot of reasonably recent exciting technologies that are such a big deal that they're talked about in job postings. At some point, it's like you see this in academia, if a paper becomes so canonical, it just gets referred to.
Yeah.
You stop citing, like we have this thing called white robust standard errors. No one cites the paper anymore. So I think we're great at getting important technologies early on, but after some window, maybe 30, 40 years, they become so commonplace, they disappear out.
Somewhat related to that, using the text as a database also sort of resolves a little bit of a philosophical question that you kind of touched on, which is, what do we mean when we say technology? So there's sort of an engineering sense in which, you know, transistors are probably much more important an invention than smartphones. The way that this is resolved here is that employers find mentioning the smartphone important enough to spend one of their 500 or maybe two of their 500 words on that, trying to signal that in this job, you're going to have to be able to, you know, use a smartphone. So in a sense, you can rely on it. So we're relying on the text here to essentially use the terminology that's developed to kind of signal these are the skills that you need in this job. So by no means should our results here kind of be taken to suggest that in an engineering sense, the smartphone was super important. We don't know that. So it's an employment sense.
Okay. So let's, Aaron Carter has a question. Can we let Aaron Carter?
Hi there, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. This is an absolutely fascinating paper, and you can do obviously so much with this data. So my question is, you know, not the core focus of your paper, but I'm really curious nonetheless. Did you explore local variation and technological innovation outside those core areas that are really dominating these new technologies, Silicon Valley and the East Coast? And were you able to find any variation or anything that explains the variation in that sort of local variation and innovations? I'm curious because there seems like there would be very interesting public policy recommendations for cities and states and how to encourage or foster innovation outside of these core areas. Thank you.
I'm happy to take a first cut then. So, Erin, super interesting question. One thing, I mean, for me, what was surprising if I look at the entire arc of the project, the most amazing thing is how incredibly concentrated these new technologies, particularly successful ones, are in Silicon Valley. You kind of live out there. You live out here, but you don't quite realize it's like, you know, there's almost half of US technologies are coming out of just small parts of the US. In the regression, we looked at what could account for birth of sorry, in the paper, it was like universities basically a huge driver of it. So if I was to take away to policymakers, if you wanted to have your area really successful, universities, particularly research intense universities generating a lot of grads, PhDs, seem an enormous driver. There are other quirks, like I think for digital vision, isn't it Fort Bragg? You know, there's some weird places because an original Kodak location. But if you were to run regressions, you find universities account for an enormous share of the variation. I think Silicon Valley has benefited massively from, you know, Stanford and that other place beginning with a B. That, you know, is up the street, but yeah, and the Northeast Corridor clearly has all these, you know, elite early stage institutions. I mean, as a Brit, you see it in the UK that kind of London, Oxford, Cambridge have really dominated.
The one thing I would add to that, Aaron, is that there is a real lack of data to essentially study this kind of question at scale. So the question of what are the markers of a successful innovation hub, for example. And one, like we've actually posted all this data online. So one of the things that you can find in our data is firm level numbers for essentially employment, early employment at mentioning new technologies in specific places. So this data could open up an avenue to study at a fairly micro level the evolution of innovation hubs in a way that we haven't been able to do before. In addition to also having a systematic way of flagging what we mean by an innovation hub. So we have this notion of a pioneer location that's sort of basic, like, so nobody went and picked them, We have sort of a data criterion for where they are and when you become one. And we hope that there's going to be a lot of scope for making progress on these questions in the future.
Erin, do you have anything we should look at, by the way? Any other? We focused a lot on universities, graduates. Is there any other things we should look at? Thanks.
Thank you. I agree with what Tarek was saying. I just think there's tremendous, just given how micro this data is, I think that would be a fascinating paper to write. And I would be curious about variation in local level policies, right? If you can find cities that changed, policies, tax rates or welcoming workers, et cetera, I think that those sorts of, being able to very clearly identify changes following a policy adoption would be really fascinating in terms of trying to sort of scale up recommendations for cities.
So on that score, I was wondering about the role of corporate R&D labs. And, there's a long history in the United States of competing for manufacturing plant locations. But maybe the message of your paper is that localities would be better off trying to attract corporate R&D labs. And are those important as in the innovation hubs you identify? It's obviously hard to separate them from the effects of universities because they tend to come hand in hand. But are there some major innovation centers in your data that lack a major research university but have a big corporate R&D lab?
The answer is yes, that there definitely are some examples there. And I think, it was in the slide, which was mentioned on the digital photography, Fort Collins had which generally you don't think of as an academic hub, had a big HP research facility, which seems to have led to a number of the early patents and so forth. But I think what you're getting at is something that our data would allow us to do in a way that could be quite fascinating, which is essentially, if you think about what policymakers want to do, in many cases, the idea is to sort of create a real hub, right? Where it's not just dependent on one firm. Think about Rochester and its dependence on Kodak. And once Kodak went up, R&D in Rochester just collapsed, right? But instead, where policymakers are sort of striving to get some sort of hub in terms of activity where it's essentially something much more like, Minneapolis and medical devices. Yes, there's Medtronic, but there's also hundreds of other firms and venture capitalists funding them and the like. And it sort of is not really dependent on, any one CEO making a series of bad decisions and tanking the industry, as you can argue happened in the case of Kodak. So if that's the case, our data should allow us to look at this because we can see not only the cases where you have one firm generating a bunch of jobs around a new technology, but also ones where you've got, either other large rivals or, startups and so forth, and can really characterize the job creation in much more detail. And I think in a way that may be more a question that strategy researchers are interested rather than traditionally economists, but I think it's a really important set of issues that is certainly something that we hope to go down the avenue we hope to pursue next.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. So can I go back to a different issue? Maybe it's related to something Justin was asking about, but if you look in your data set, you get a lot of attention in earnings conference calls for a period of time. You can go back and look ex post and see which ones turned out to be something of a bust. And we know that in the late 1990s was famous for many new IPOs are based around technology, some of which became behemoth corporations, but many more failed. And it seems like we're in another such era now with all these AI-based startups. There was just an article in the Wall Street Journal, I think today, about all the money that's pouring into AI, and many of these companies don't even have a product, let alone a business model. So did you look at the ones that went through in discussions in earnings conference calls, the technologies, but then 5-10 years later, they just disappeared? Can you characterize that in any way?
So the problem with the earnings calls is that we basically have 22 years of data there.
Okay.
The place to really look for this is the time series of the patenting activity, I think. And there you really see like boom bust cycles like very clearly. We haven't really done anything with this data. It's on our list. We haven't really gotten to it.
Okay.
But I think that's a very interesting question.
Steve, back to Justin's comment earlier, what is reassuring is that earnings calls and job postings line up pretty tightly.
Yeah.
So you could worry about one or the other, but the ones that are, home runs in earnings calls with tons of, like take cloud computing or smartphones, they're all over earnings calls, but they're also all over jobs postings. And I know monoclonal antibodies, which is much less commonly mentioned, is much less commonly mentioned in both. And I think they both have strengths and weaknesses, but together that makes us more reassured. But yeah, it doesn't exactly answer your forward-looking question.
Yeah, there's look, we know, but something about that is that I remember the picture you showed on the relation, the high covariance between importance on your earnings call measure and your job ads measure. But we also know that there's a big difference between technologies that become important and business models that succeed around those technologies. So there were many companies trying to do what Amazon did. Most of them lost, and Amazon won. So somehow there's got to be a lot of companies that were talking about technologies in their earnings conference calls, and they weren't part of the winner take most outcome. So maybe so you aren't really looking at things at that level. You're aggregating all the discussions in the earnings calls about a technology into just one bucket. But you can also think of the firms that were talking about a particular technology at one point of time. What happened to them? Presumably all of the firms that were competing with Amazon in the late 1990s, most of them, either they disappeared entirely, or they figured out something else to do that they could succeed at because they couldn't compete against Amazon, at least in, my recollection of how things played out. So it's a different, but figuring out what happened to the companies that are talking about certain technologies is a different question than whether the technology itself succeeded. And it seems like you are well positioned to investigate that issue too.
Agreed.
I would agree violently with that, because certainly, again, certainly in the realm of anecdote, right, there's lots of examples of, AT&T doing this series of TV ads in the 1980s, which basically, completely anticipated most of the developments of ICT in terms of mobile phones and, wireless communications and, World Wide Web and so forth. Of course, AT&T, that entity, ended up getting zero market share in terms of being able to commercialize that. But we're early on, clearly someone within the marketing group had a very prescient view of the future. And, it is fascinating to think about what one could do in terms of thinking about, corporate awareness of future technologies and, the way in which they invest. And, is there anything we can say about who are the prescient people who actually deliver, as opposed to the ones who didn't, and opposed to the guys who just didn't talk about it at all? I think it's a fascinating avenue to pursue.
Yeah. Can we, he's got a follow-up to Aaron's question that sounds interesting. So let's let Hans speak.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Really fascinating talk. Thank you so much. So I have like two questions. One is indeed a follow-up to Aaron's question. So I was also really interested in thinking about local variation and kind of like the adoption of new technologies and like the regional broadening that you described. And one variable that I was really curious to think more about is migration, both internal and international. So I think in terms of internal migration, I think one big limiting factor might be the availability of housing and to what extent kind of like, areas can create like the right conditions for like people to move to these places and then like with like obviously the right skill set. And then for international migration, I'm wondering if there's any correlation between kind of like local immigration policies and the extent to which like local areas are welcoming towards international migrants, if that can have an effect on kind of like the kind of like spread of new technologies. And then my other question is probably way out of the scope of your project, but I'm wondering about like the international comparison here. So I always get like the sense that technology is like very highly concentrated, way more concentrated in the United States than in other parts of the world, especially like, if you think about European countries. And I was wondering if you have any sense of that, whether that is true or not, and if so, what might explain kind of like the very highly spatial concentration of R&D in the US compared to like other rich democracies. Thank you.
So these are really great questions. Akash, do you want to take the one about the international spillovers?
Yeah, so I suppose like the one limitation in doing international spillovers is the burning glass data. It's not quite available across all the countries, but some English-speaking countries. But you could still look at international spillovers in patenting. And in particular, I mean, in the past, I have looked at the similarity of these technical terms, which I was highlighting across countries, and they are heavily correlated with migration of skill from those countries at the county level. So if you imagine like, Chicago having a lot of Germans, then Chicago patents will look pretty similar to past German patents when comparing these phrases across patenting. So that's something which we looked at. But doing this analysis for technology concentration in Germany would be hard because job posting data is not available.
But I would go one step further. So what Akash has this brilliant paper kind of buried in his dissertation that he hasn't had time to really write up, which kind of shows a causal link between historical migrations from different origins and the subsequent flow of ideas as measured with the linguistic footprint of different ways of talking about technology. So if your county has historical migration from places that are good at building cars, you get ideas about car building more readily from these origins. And I think that's sort of a very, well, now that doesn't say anything about comparative advantage, but it makes it very plausible that having a diverse population gives you a comparative advantage in assimilating these ideas.
And I was going to say, actually, the international thing is really interesting. It makes it much more striking how concentrated this is. Because if you look at all of these technologies, they're concentrated in a few parts of the US. Very few of these actually originated outside the US. So you can make the same comment, but globally. Most of these technologies actually, probably, close to 50% of global technologies come out of, over this time period, Silicon Valley and the Northeast Corridor. So it's pretty striking, actually, how the US has become so dominant in technological development. The other thing is, it's funny in your clusters thing. I remember I was at an event in Downing Street like 20 years ago when they were saying we need to start up, 10 clusters. Michael Porter's really big into clusters. And they said we need 10 technology clusters in the UK. And someone said, well, we'll be lucky to get like one, let alone 10. It's like, and if you look at the thing that strikes me about the US actually is that it does has multiple clusters. There is Silicon Valley, but there's DC and there's Chicago and there's Boston, etc., and Austin. So I'm not sure the US is more concentrated. It's maybe similar to Europe, but compared to any individual European country, it's actually surprisingly spread. It's just that once you get agglomeration, economies of scale, you just naturally get clusters. So in the UK, it's basically one. There's really the Southeast, and that's it. So I actually think the US is, for me, is surprisingly spread out. There are multiple centers.
Okay, anything more from you, Justin?
No, that was great. Thank you
Yeah,
all.
that was a fascinating talk. So we're gonna turn the recording off. Anyone who wants to is welcome to stick around. And thanks guys. That was really great, and we look forward to more work to come. And Akash, I agree. Your job market, you're buried in your dissertation paper, sounds super interesting. You should get that out, and please, I'd love to see it. Thanks very much.